Hello, welcome to this webinar brought to you by the International Behavioural Trials Network, IBTN. IBTN is a global network of individuals working to improve the quality of behavioral interventions and behavioral clinical trials. This webinar is presented by Dr. Simon Bacon. He's a professor in the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Applied Physiology at Concordia University, and is a co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Center at the CUSNIM. He's also the CIHR Board Chair in Innovative Patient-Oriented Behavioral Clinical Trials and the FRQS Chair in Behavioral Medicine. Dr. Simon Bacon has had extensive training in the development and testing of behavioral interventions, including exercise, weight management, stress management, and motivational interviewing. Today, he will be talking more about some of the unique elements of behavioral interventions and the newer framework that can be used to develop and test them. Throughout the presentation, you can definitely post your questions using the chat function, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. In addition, please note that the presentation will be posted on the IBTN website sometime after the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Kieran. So just to say that welcome everybody. I know we have some people from actually all around the world. I think we've got about 4 continents joining us. So I feel very privileged to be speaking to everyone here today. Just to reinforce what Kieran said, if you do have a question, you can post it through chat. If you go to sort of the main bar, should be probably at the bottom of where the presentation is, you can see the chat button, and if you can't see it, if you click on more, you will see there's an option to chat. If you just click on that, you can type your questions as we go, and as Kieran said, we'll try and answer as many of them as possible at the end. I'm going to talk for probably about 30 minutes, hopefully, and so that should give us plenty of time to get to those questions. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about behavioral intervention trials in general, sort of highlight some of the issues that we've run into in the past, and trying to sort of identify how do we move forward in the future in a more structured way. This is really going to be at a very sort of relatively high level. I'm not going to get too much into a lot of specific details. We're hoping that through IBTN we'll start being able to answer some more of those specifics with future webinars. So keep your eyes peeled for those coming. These are my disclosures. Absolutely none of them have anything whatsoever to do with this, but coming from a medical world, I always feel like I should put that slide up. So today, as I kind of mentioned, I'm going to cover 3 areas. I'm just going to highlight some of these limitations, talk about the newer processes for generating and testing behavioral interventions, and at the end, I'm hopefully going to leave you with some questions that you should always be asking of any studies that you read or see in the literature, or might be thinking of doing yourself. And these sort of are sometimes helpful pieces that allow you to sort of have a critical eye on what you should be doing and what people have done. So why do we need more rigorous methods? Well, I'm going to start with the cautionary tale that over the last, I'd say 10, 15 years, there have been more and more trials coming out, larger scale trials with a reasonable amount of money that have actually been generally disappointing in terms of their outcomes. And here's just a smattering. There's lots of them, but some of these are actually quite large. And of course, this really raises the question of or makes people start to think about the fact that, behavior, and we have plenty of epidemiological literature that shows that behavior is associated with poor behaviors are associated with worse clinical outcomes. People that engage in better behaviors tend to do better, but the trials don't seem to be matching that. And it's kind of like, it doesn't make sense. And the question sometimes is why? And just to sort of highlight, I'm going to pull out Look Ahead. This is my favorite trial to sort of poke around in. Many of you, I'm sure, will probably know the Look Ahead trial, but for those that don't, I'm just going to go through it and then just talk about some of the issues that this raises. Fundamentally, Look Ahead was a study looking at the impact of a weight loss, which was specifically a lifestyle intervention, on MACE, which is major adverse cardiovascular events, in patients who are overweight with type 2 diabetes. It's a large trial. It was 5,000 people, 16 centers. It's a US-based trial. The intervention was focused on reducing calories, increasing physical activity. It was weekly counseling meetings for the first 6 months and then reduced after that, but it was still, pretty engaging across the whole period of the study. The comparison condition was a diabetes education program where participants met 3 times a year for the first 4 years, but still had engagement beyond that. And in this particular case, major adverse cardiovascular events were death from cardiovascular causes, non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, or hospitalization for angina. The hospitalization for angina is an interesting story unto itself. We won't have time to get into that, but if you ever get a chance to meet me, you can ask me that question and I'll go into that one as well. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, the total estimated cost for this study, and it's hard to find an exact number, but it's approximately about $100 million, American, US dollars, that was used to fund this trial. And that's public money. So it's pretty significant undertaking. And if we look at the results of the trial, so this is MACE was the major outcome, what we see is not much is going on. Just to be sure, they blew this up and made it as tight as possible, as big as possible to hopefully see some difference. But as you see, there's nothing going on there. And so effectively, Look Ahead was a null trial. And really, if it's a null trial, this leads us to 2 potential conclusions as to why it was a null trial. So the first one is a failure of the hypothesis, i.e. weight loss does not lead to reductions in MACE in patients with type 2 diabetes. And I work with a lot of physicians. I work in cardiovascular disease, I work in diabetes, and I will be honest and say that the vast majority of people took away that message, which kind of reinforced the idea, physicians aren't easily convinced that lifestyle is important. This further reinforced that they didn't have to worry about this. However, alternatively, it could actually be just a failure of the intervention. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull apart a little bit of the intervention and see if that actually may be the case. Because certainly if it's a failure of the intervention, the hypothesis may still stand, and there still may be value in targeting weight loss in the context of diabetes. So if we take obviously MACE was the primary outcome, we take one step back and look at the behavioral targets that were included within this trial, and for the intervention piece, two outcomes were identified. The first outcome was a 7% decrease in weight from baseline relative to control, and 175 minutes per week of moderate vigorous physical activity in the intervention group compared to the control group. And the why the 175 is related to previous studies that were done with the group by this group, and the fact that this study was started sort of before the 150-minute revolution occurred. So if we break this down, let's look at what happened on the weight side of things. Okay, so this is actually the pattern of weight loss across the 10 years in the intervention arm. The red dotted line is the 7% decrease. And so on the face of it, you'd go, wow, that's pretty impressive. The classic tick mark, they got a lot of most of the weight loss occurred in the first year, then it sort of bounced up a bit, and then it sort of fluctuates around the 7%. The problem is that when you actually look at this study, the comparison arm, the control arm, also lost weight. So actually when you do the comparison between the intervention arm and the control arm, the overall net weight loss was only 4%. So they did not achieve their intervention targets. And I think this raises some real issues about the appropriateness of the control group that they used in this study. With regards to the physical activity, well, this was not reported. So there's actually no 10-year follow-up data on the physical activity for this particular study. However, it's such a large study, obviously they're publishing stuff all the time, and what's interesting is there's an early phase report on the physical activity of the participants and the percentage of people achieving the targets. And what you see here is in black is the intervention group, and in the shade, the gray shade, is the comparison group. So you can see even at year 4, less than 20% of the intervention arm are achieving the 175 minutes. Obviously, at the end of year 1, it looked a little bit better. Interestingly, 10% of the people who are in the comparison group are achieving, so there's only less than a 10% difference between the two. So clearly, at 10 years, this is not going to be achieved. What's also interesting about this particular study and this particular figure is if you look at baseline, at baseline, about 15 to 17% of these people were already doing 175 minutes of physical activity per week. And so this also raises another interesting question about that we often see in behavioral intervention trials is, why are you trying to intervene on people that are already actually doing the behavior that you actually want them to engage in? So, just these two figures right here raise a whole series of questions about the appropriate structure of this particular trial, the potential efficacy and ultimate effectiveness of the actual intervention itself. And so then, okay, this isn't particularly good news. Let's take a step back and say, well, what did they actually do within the intervention? And this is the paragraph out of the actual paper. And so I forgot to mention this, but this was published in New England Journal of Medicine, so it was not a particularly shabby paper. What you see here is the lifestyle intervention is modeled on group behavioral programs developed for treatment of obese patients, type 2 diabetes, includes intervention components, DPP, also use strategies shown to be effective, et cetera, et cetera. There is one other sort of methods paper that sits out there that doesn't have a huge amount of detail, but effectively, when you strip it all away, what you have is an intervention that's including multiple elements drawn from a variety of different studies. They're actually quite explicit about that they took the core of the DPP and then just added everything that they'd learned about the DPP, bundled it all together. They didn't formally test the intervention. As we know from DPP, so this is DPP plus, so DPP plus complexity. We know from DPP that 20, 30 years down the line, we're still trying to work out how to implement DPP due to its complexity. So now we have an even more complex. So will this get into clinical utility? Probably not. And just to highlight, this is $100 million of public money. Okay, I would go out on a limb and say, if you just took 1% of that budget and actually just did some work around developing, testing the intervention prior to launching into that $100 million, could have been a useful thing to do. But that's not what they did. So that's a really good example. It's probably the best example of a very high impact, high level behavioral intervention trial that didn't work out and may have not worked out because of some of the conceptualization of the development and ultimately testing of the intervention itself. So what do we do about it? Okay, well, before worrying about the specifics, what you want to do is go back to basics and think about an intervention cascade. Okay, I'm just a small deviation here because I like to say that I always like to do this. So we don't have a mechanism to have you vote on this, but I'm going to ask the question, is exercise a behavioral intervention? And all of you sitting at home, you can raise your hands if you think it is at this point in time. And now all those that think it isn't, raise your hand. And I've done this presentation a number of times, and I would imagine probably half the rooms raise their hand to say yes, and half the rooms probably raise their hand to say no. The reality is that exercise is not a behavioral intervention. Okay, for exercise to be a behavioral intervention that I was leading, I would be physically standing there or kneeling down, moving people's legs around a bike. That's me doing a behavioral exercise intervention or leading a behavioral exercise intervention. all behavioral interventions ultimately can be broken down into the actual behavior change technique components. And at this point in time, probably the best way of being able to define that is with Suzumiki's BCT taxonomy, which is an example, which is here. It's very small, so just pulling out some examples here. And actually, in reality, what we do, for example, with an exercise intervention is not exercise, but it's all of these smaller BCTs. And so I'll just give you an example here. One that we like to do a lot is behavioral practice and rehearsal. We have people coming into a fitness area or into a lab. We show them how to do the exercise. We get them to practice it. We get them to go away and practice it and come back and tell us how they did, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one example of the actual intervention that we're delivering. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because when we take a step back and we actually look at this cascade and we start thinking about what is the behavioral treatment, we have to get to that sort of granular level. And I'm just going to give you two examples of how this would look. And so I'm going to use look ahead as my working example, so weight loss from major adverse cardiovascular events. And I'm going to break this down. So, two things that we might implement within a multitude of other things that we would have in this complex intervention might be self-monitoring and behavioral rehearsal, okay? So they're the actual treatment components of all of these BCTs. And those components are then actually leading to us changing a particular behavior. So for the self-monitoring, what we want people to do is record food intake and calories. For the behavioral rehearsal, we want people to actually conduct pre-planned exercise. We then want that to translate to a behavioral risk factor, so an actual change in a behavior that we know is associated with outcomes. So here it might be on the food side of things, if people are recording food, and we know that self-monitoring is really great at this, just the practice of recording food intake often leads to people's changes in behavior that translates to reducing calories. And so we might target reducing calories to 500 kilocalories per week. And then for the conducting pre-planned exercise, we want people then to ultimately target getting 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. We hope that that will translate into some biomedical risk factor, which in this case, in this example, is a loss of body weight. 7% is a clinically significant change. And then that hopefully will translate into a reduction in our key clinical outcome, which major adverse cardiovascular events. And so before even starting your trial, you want to be mapping out all of this piece. And if you have gaps, you want to be going away thinking about how do I fill those gaps. One thing to also add, of course, is that there are unintended ways by which these behavior changes lead to improvements in outcomes that may not be through body weights. We sort of always acknowledge that. So how do we go about developing these studies and thinking about how to structure our research program to build this great intervention that's going to work? Well, there's been two models that have been at the forefront of this. There's the MRC complex interventions framework, and then the orbit model, which are represented here. They are, depending on which side of the ocean, depends normally on which preference you have. I really like both bits of both of these. And so, what we've been doing in IBTN is sort of thinking about how do we extract the best of both worlds here. And we've sort of come up with a bit of a hybrid model, which has some of the components about moving through phases, as well as having a little bit more of a circular element to it to sort of demonstrate that these things are constantly in flux. What I'm going to do is go through this model very briefly and give you sort of the overview. Before I get to that, this is a shameless plug. I'm sure most of you are quite aware of IBTN. I'm sure most of you are quite aware that this coming May, we have our actual conference, which will run from the 28th to the 30th of May in Montreal. The provisional program's up on the website. Go check it out. We'll be running our summer school in parallel with that. In 2021, we're going to do another summer school that will be in French, the great news of being in a bilingual city like Montreal. And then in 2022, we'll have another conference and another English summer school. So keep your eyes peeled for information coming about that. If you want to come to the conference, go to the website. All the details are there. Okay, so this model, I'm going to sort of just slowly break down each of the pieces to give you an overview of what we mean by some of this stuff. And we're going to start in the core center. And we're going to start with the significant clinical question, okay? And my experience has generally been that within behavioral trials and behavioral intervention development, most people start with the Slagiat principle. And for those that don't know what the Slagiat principle is, it's quite simply seem like a good idea at a time. And I have been a reviewer on peer review for quite a while. I have seen lots of people literally come and say, I want to do this intervention in this group because we think it would be really helpful. Or, you know, exercise has worked in this other population, therefore we think we should do it here. And use that literally as a justification. And as for me, I don't think running a marathon is a great idea. I don't think this approach to actually developing science is necessarily a good idea as well. Rather, we should be thinking about the concept of equipoise. And really, you know, equipoise is at the core of everything. And equipoise is the fact that there is a genuine uncertainty in the expert medical community over whether a treatment will be beneficial or not. Okay, so that's critically important. We don't know. If we know, we don't need to worry. But you need to have that uncertainty. And clinical trials, so this is starting point, clinical trials should only be conducted if there is meaningful uncertainty about the results they will produce. Okay. Now that's obviously at the ultimate end, but it's kind of important when conceptualizing the intervention to have that philosophy in mind. Okay, you really need that level of uncertainty to make it worth moving forward with. And this is just to say equipoise should be the ethical foundation of trials. So what is a significant clinical question? Okay, so in the context of behavioral interventions, it's a clinical question or problem for which a behavioral treatment could provide a real solution. And that sounds pretty obvious, but then actually if you peel that back one layer, what does that then break down to? Well, for a particular disease or a particular scenario, you currently don't have a treatment. Okay, that would be certainly a good area to think about. Maybe a behavioral treatment might work. Alternative, you could have a current treatment, just not very potent or durable. That would be another reason. A current treatment is effective, but adherence to it is poor. It works, but people don't like it. Another one is a current treatment produces lots of side effects. So use in clinical practice is very limited. So these are the kinds of actual issues that we should be understanding and then trying to tackle with a behavioral intervention. So the other core component that to always start from is the significant clinical question and the concept of implementation science. And I'm going to give you a very rudimentary overview of implementation science. It's a lot more complicated than I'm making it sound, but I just want to give you the high level on this. Ultimately, implementation science is built around the idea of starting with the end in mind. And Stephen Covey has been a very great advocate around that concept. You know, one of the issues, and I come back to look ahead and I come back to DPP, you know, DPP, the Diabetes Prevention Program, is held up as sort of like the cornerstone of success for behavioral interventions. The issue has been is that it's hard to implement in clinical practice because when that was created, that idea of implementation and the idea of embedding it within clinical practice wasn't at the forefront of what they were thinking about. They were just thinking about what's going to work, so the efficacy. If you don't have that vision of where you want to go, and you don't design your intervention to be usable down the line is a huge wasted opportunity, I would argue. Okay, so that's important. How do you go about doing that? There are a number of different ways. One of the key things is obviously engaging all the key stakeholders throughout the entire process. So not just patients and community users, but healthcare professionals, administrators, policymakers, whoever is going to have some impact on the delivery of this, they should all be there and they should all be part of that process. And right from the beginning, not just being surveyed to see what they think, but actually at the point of decision making, at the point of developing protocols, et cetera, et cetera. So moving on, so that's the central core. The next thing is this concept building component, okay? And obviously the concept of your intervention should be built around two things, theory and data. So there are many theories out there, and we all have our favorite theories, and we can, obviously some theories we like and some theories we don't. But the theories are out there, so you build it around theory and you build it around data. The kinds of data you can use at this point in time, well, there are animal studies out there that we can leverage. So some processes, so neurological processes in terms of behavior, we understand from that. Imaging studies, epidemiological data, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, qualitative studies. You could have, lab-based studies. All of these components, this becomes our basic science. It's the basic behavioral science. And we need to leverage off of all of that to be able to think about what we need to deliver in our intervention. So a good solid foundation there. Once we have that, we're into then thinking about the actual structure of the actual intervention itself. So you've got this define, refine piece. So defining the basic elements, what are my hypothesized pathways by which my behavioral treatment is going to work? Reinforcing not only the scientific basis of the actual treatment itself, but actually my milestones. So if you remember in that cascade, it's not just a question of changing behavior, it's changing behavior enough that it's going to translate into some clinical impact, okay? You want to, obviously, all the different individual components, we have many, many options out there. Also as well, thinking about who am I targeting this towards, okay? Not every intervention is going to work in every person. Not every disease is going to be impacted by this. So really understanding who is my target audience and how much do I need to build into my intervention to actually deliver for those people. And then always, I mean, this is inherent throughout the entire process, but it starts at the very, very beginning. Thinking about safety, something that we quite often ignore, tolerability and acceptability. So these should be fundamental questions that we're asking all the way along the development process to make sure that we're checking safety, tolerability, and acceptability. So once we've defined sort of our basic elements, we want to refine them. Okay, so we want to understand, we may have a whole slew of things, which pieces are important, which pieces interact with each other, how much, how do I deliver, do I want it to be able to tailor within the intervention? And really, collectively, this is the optimization process. So we're really trying to optimize that whole thing, always thinking about safety, tolerability, and acceptability. One thing that's really important, and this is something that is critical as you're developing these studies, is that you've got to focus on the behavioral outcomes at this point in time. In this refine, define phase, if you can't shift the behaviors, who cares what it does to the clinical outcomes? Okay, so that's an important element. The other critical thing is statistical significance is really not important. I know this sort of goes against everything that most people have been taught, but the reality here is you're not p-value. You shouldn't be a slave to the p-value here. Okay, you really don't need sample size. You're trying to see if there's a signal. and if you're really trying to see the signal and you've got this focus around these behavioral outcomes, then this concept of minimally clinically important difference becomes more important. Okay, can I shift all of my participants to going from not achieving that level to achieving that level? Can I shift the majority? How much is enough? How much of a change would I see in these people? These are the kind of questions. Whether it's statistically significant or not is not important. And ultimately, there are many different ways to approach this question, and you don't need necessarily a lot of large sample sizes to do this. But a lot of this kind of early phase prep work can save you a lot of pain and a lot of expense down the line. Okay, so you feel like you've got a pretty good intervention. You've worked hard, and now you'd be moving on to phase 2, which is where you're starting to not develop but get more into the testing piece, right? I'm actually going to sort of trial it out and see what's going on. So we'll start with proof of concept. So now you might start asking the question, well, okay, so I've demonstrated that it can change the behaviors. I might have sort of a peek at some of the early phase or proxy clinical measures. I might be interested to know, can it just do it on its own? And always start with that. I see a lot of people building in randomization, building in a comparison group very early in their processes, even before they've even demonstrated that this intervention is a strong intervention. My personal take on this, and people agree and disagree about this, but my personal take is if you're doing 60 people and you're randomizing 30 to the intervention and 30 to comparison, I'd say you're wasting 30 people who could be feeding into better optimization of your intervention. And you're just wasting their time at this point. That being said, some people do some elements around the comparison group, but interestingly, the proof of concept phase, it's not always necessarily about comparing directly the intervention to the comparison group, but oftentimes it's about understanding the comparison group. That's another thing we do very poorly. We don't actually formally test our comparison groups. We don't have a good handle on how much those comparisons group changed the risk factor. We don't understand much about dropouts, crossovers, credibility, acceptability, and so on. And these things are all quite important in the ultimate trial, as you saw in Look Ahead, right? So on the weight management side, on the weight loss side of it, the comparison group killed that trial. And that comparison group arguably may not have been appropriate. But some testing of that ahead of time would have given you a signal to tell you whether it was going to be appropriate or not, or likely to be appropriate or not. So doing some of that up front is not a bad thing. Ultimately, during the proof of concept process, you really want to be thinking about the treatment manual. So you've done all the refine, define. This is really, showing does it work, but at the same time, you want to be developing that treatment manual. The way that we approach this is always thinking about, if I had to teach this to someone else, if I wanted to do a multi-site study, could I put it all together and give it to them? This is where we start with proof of concept. Also, as well, in parallel to that, thinking about how I'm going to actually monitor the fidelity of my interventionists or the intervention, especially with the e-health components these days, right? And starting to build that as well. Once again, thinking about, and part of this is thinking about implementation. If I might be really good in my center because I know this inside out, but can I actually then translate it into other sites, other centers, and other people? Okay, so you move beyond that and you're into feasibility and pilot studies. So I'm just going to sort of give you a little bit of an overview of this area. I'll start by saying there's nothing definitive about feasibility and pilot studies. This is a huge area where people are still doing a lot of work, trying to disentangle, make sense of it all. But I'll give you just sort of our current thinking as it stands at the moment. A feasibility study is a study which provides information on if a proposed trial can be done, should be done, and if so, how. Okay, that's it. A pilot study is actually a very specific feasibility study. It's kind of the mini-me of a real trial. Okay, and I'm going to break these down and give you a little bit more details, but that's how it breaks down. Pilot studies are feasibility studies, but they're very focused on really being the precursor to the main trial. So generally, the purpose of feasibility studies, number one, these are designed to answer specific questions about the future conduct of the trial. So a feasibility study doesn't exist for the sake of a feasibility study. It exists to be able to answer something fundamental that you need to know about whether you can deliver your final trial or not. So you need to know what that trial is. It's not a standalone study. This is not an entity unto itself. It's a step in a process. The kind of things you can actually talk about and sort of test out, things around process. So, you know, can I recruit? Can I deliver the intervention? Do I have the tools available? Resources? Sorry, that's about, do I have the tools available? Can I, a good example is we were doing a study around some imaging, and we did some feasibility, and we suddenly realized that, you know, though the scanners were close to us, they were booked for so much of the day that it almost became impossible to do the trial because we couldn't get the participants in at a time that worked for them that would allow us access to the actual assessment equipment. Okay, so it sounds relatively small, but it's kind of important. Issues around management. Can I train other sites if it's a multi-site? How would I onboard them? Even within my own study, right? Can I actually get access to recruit the patients? And then actual questions around the actual treatment itself, right? Can I effectively deliver the treatment? These are all questions about, can I do this? Can it be done? Can it be done appropriately to make my final trial work? Specifically, pilot studies really test aspects of randomization. So for most feasibility studies, you don't actually need randomization. If you're testing all of those other things about process and resources and et cetera, you know, you don't need to worry about randomization. So randomizing early may not be important at that point. For a true pilot study, you'd really want to then embed randomization into it. And this would be things like, you know, formally testing in the scenario that you're going to deliver the final trial, the willingness of people to participate in the comparison group, measure exact unintended crossovers, adherence, dropouts, etc. Okay. And once again, as I said, this is really, you got to think about it as the small microcosm of the final big trial. Importantly, what pilot studies are not. They're not a less expensive way to assess efficacy. Remember, the whole point of a feasibility study, of which pilot study is a subcomponent, is not to measure efficacy, it's to measure a question of, can I do this or not? They are also not guarantees that a full study will be successful or positive. They are not a good way of creating sample size and effect size estimates for the full study. And I could go into that in greater detail some other time, but there's lots of simulations that have shown that the point estimates out of small scale pilot studies that are there to test the feasibility components of delivering the trial are invariably horribly inaccurate. What are the main outcomes of feasibility in pilot studies? Effectively, you're broken down into only a few things, right? So do you continue without modification? So feasible as is, continue without modification, but monitor closely. So feasible, but you have some concerns in certain areas. Continue, but modify the protocol. Okay, so somewhere during this, you realize things weren't working. Maybe you made a small adjustment. Maybe you found a solution so that you're going to be able to rectify it, or stop. This is one we don't use very often, but stop is a totally legitimate thing to do at the end of a feasibility study. Go back and revisit. And just to emphasize that, coming back to the final model, one thing I really want to highlight, and this is really important, is that throughout this entire model are all these bidirectional arrows. And this is critically important. This is not a one-shot deal. And if you take a structured approach to this, the idea is that as you move through phases, you only move forward if you're getting success. If you're not getting success, you go backwards and you redefine. The pharmaceutical industry have been very good at understanding this, and obviously the economics of this is very different, but they're not afraid of failing. They know that to find that one medication that's going to be successful, they're probably going to have to churn through, tens of thousands of other formulations of molecules to get to it. But better to fail early than fail late. And unfortunately, what we tend to do quite often with behavioral interventions is not do the early phase stuff, not fail early, put all of our eggs into one big basket, the mishmash of intervention, throw it out there into an efficacy trial and fail at that point. So, there's just, if we take a step back and think about better development processes, we might be better off. I was going to very briefly mention, I forgot to mention this, the formal intervention testing piece. Obviously, you have your efficacy trial. And the good news is if you've gone through that entire process, here's where you have your best chance intervention. There's no guarantee that this is going to work, but you feel, you're going to feel pretty confident that you've ticked all the boxes, that it's going to be the best thing you have. And if it doesn't work, you feel pretty confident this is actually maybe a failure of the hypothesis and that actually that's not the route to go, versus a failure of the intervention unto itself. Obviously, the effectiveness trial, this is ultimately asking the question, can we do this in the real world? This is quite often synonymous with pragmatic trials, and so that's a big area that's growing. But it's not the only design that can be used in that scenario. And obviously, pragmatism falls along a continuum of efficacy and effectiveness. I am just going to end with some key things. So whenever you think about, if you may want to do an intervention, develop an intervention and do an intervention trial, or if you've read an article, some things that normally are good starting points to be critical with in terms of the literature and your own thinking. And very simply, was the intervention appropriately developed? So can they detail how they developed this intervention? What were the steps they went through? Is the intervention being delivered to the people who should be getting it? This comes back to this issue of, the number of trials I've seen where people have developed a very nice intervention, and it may be treating, say, medication adherence, but they're starting with the general population, of which we know, 30 to 40% are probably adherent to their medication and don't need this intervention. But they're going to randomize and take anybody and give it to these people that don't need it. The parallel is always, would you give a smoking cessation intervention to someone that doesn't smoke? No. So if that's sort of the rule of thumb test with that. Is the behavioral target of the intervention being measured? So even though at the end of this process, you want to get to what's the clinical impact, you need to be measuring those behavioral pieces all the way along, and you want to demonstrate that they work. And that even in your final trial, that you change the behaviors you were targeting. Always, is the comparison group really appropriate? And Ken Friedland has just, he convened a group at NIH, and they published a paper last year, which is a beautiful overview of and decision tree process about how to structure and develop comparison groups. And a final thing is the fidelity of the interventionist. And this is something that's a huge dead angle for a lot of people. The pharma world has less of an issue with this. Obviously, they're creating pills often. A white pill versus a white pill, one with the active ingredient, one without. You don't have to worry about always the details of the perception of that. Obviously, if your pill looks different or is a different color, then you get into trouble. For behavioral interventions, oftentimes the interventionist becomes such a critical component of the process of the intervention that if you don't monitor and have things in place where people can actually be checked throughout the process, make sure that they are actually delivering what they're supposed to, that's a huge problem unto itself. So they're just some examples of some things that always I recommend anytime you pick up a paper that has a behavioral intervention or a behavioral intervention trial, you can start asking these questions, and very quickly you can pull apart the quality of the paper, whether it's positive or not. So just that's all I have. We've got 10 minutes for questions. There's a reminder that the summer school and the conference it's coming up in Montreal, and there's future dates there. My final slide is just a thank you to all the members of our group, the funding that's made all of the work that we do possible. I really big shout out to people within the IBTN network who have been instrumental in conceptualizing a lot of this stuff. And thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Just a reminder, if you want to, you can use the chat box to submit a question. Also, as well, if you have questions that you want to send directly to me or to IBTN, we can do that as well.
So does anybody have any questions?
Okay, well, that's wonderful. I obviously I was so clear that there was no confusion about that one.
So, well, if there's no other questions, thank you all for participating in this IBTN webinar. If you wish to be kept up to date with what is happening at IBTN, you can definitely join. The membership is free, or even just sign up for a newsletter. Also, these details about IBTN events are available through our social media accounts, namely Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Wonderful. And just to remind people that this was recorded, we'll just tidy it up and then we'll post it. Also, the slide deck will be posted as well, a PDF of the slide deck on the IBTN website too. And I once again thank everybody for their time and joining us from all across the planet.